Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Static Within. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my family, it was a cold Wednesday evening. I had just returned home from work, exhausted from a long day of meetings and deadlines. My wife, Claire, and our two children, Emma and Max, were already in the living room, their faces bathed in the pale blue light of the TV. But something was off. There was no sound, just a low hum, and the screen displayed nothing but static. I hesitated in the doorway, watching them. Their eyes were fixed on the screen, unblinking and eerily calm, as if entranced by something I couldn't see. "What are you watching?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though the hairs on the back of my neck were already standing on end. Claire didn't respond, nor did the kids. They just sat there, motionless, their expressions blank, as if they were hypnotized. "Claire?" I called again, louder this time, but still, nothing. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer. I could hear the faint crackle of the static, like distant whispers, almost inaudible, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. I reached out to shake Claire's shoulder, and as my hand touched her, she finally turned to look at me. Her eyes were vacant, her pupils dilated and unfocused, as though she were seeing something far beyond me. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She blinked, slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, but instead of answering, she simply turned back to the TV, her gaze locked once more on the static. A shiver of fear twisted in my gut. I glanced at Emma and Max. They were just as transfixed, their small bodies rigid, their faces devoid of any emotion. I fumbled for the remote, desperate to change the channel or turn off the TV, but when I pressed the buttons, nothing happened. The static remained, stubborn and unyielding. Panic began to rise in my chest. I unplugged the TV from the wall, expecting the screen to go dark, but it didn't. The static continued to play, as though powered by something other than electricity. I stepped back, heart pounding. "Claire, we need to turn this off," I insisted, my voice breaking the silence of the room. But she didn't react. None of them did. It was as if I was the only one aware of how deeply wrong everything was. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I could feel the suffocating weight of something unnatural pressing down on me, something beyond my comprehension. As I stood there, staring at the static that had ensnared my family, I could have sworn I saw shapes flickering within the white noise, vague, shadowy figures that seemed to move and shift, almost imperceptible. My breath caught in my throat, and a deep, primal fear gripped me. Something was very wrong with this television, and whatever it was, it had taken hold of my family. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The next few days were a blur of increasing dread. My family's strange behavior continued, and my attempts to pull them away from the television only grew more desperate. Claire would snap out of her trance occasionally, just long enough to mutter something about the show they were watching, but when I pressed her for details, she would simply smile, a vacant and unsettling smile, before turning back to the static. Emma and Max were the worst. They had stopped playing with their toys, stopped talking to each other, and even stopped eating properly. They would sit in front of the TV for hours on end, their small bodies eerily still, their eyes glazed over. When I asked them what they were watching, they would respond in unison, their voices flat and devoid of emotion. "It's the new show, Daddy. Everyone's watching it." I didn't know what to do. I tried calling our doctor, but when I explained the situation, I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Maybe they're just tired, overstimulated," he suggested, though I could tell he didn't really believe me. I tried contacting friends and neighbors, asking if they had heard of this strange show, but no one knew what I was talking about. They seemed more concerned about me than anything else, suggesting that maybe I was the one who needed a break. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, I heard a faint whispering sound. It was coming from the living room, low and insistent. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, my heart pounding. The house was dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the static on the TV. The whispering grew louder as I approached, though I couldn't make out any distinct words. It was a jumble of voices, overlapping and merging, like a chorus of the damned. When I stepped into the living room, I froze. Claire, Emma, and Max were all there, standing in front of the TV, their faces mere inches from the screen. The static had changed. It was more chaotic, the shapes within it more distinct. I could see the outlines of figures now, their forms flickering in and out of existence, but the whispering was what truly unnerved me. It was coming from the TV, from the shapes in the static. They were speaking directly to my family. I wanted to scream, to rush in and pull them away, but something held me back. I could feel the air in the room growing colder, the darkness deepening. My breath came in shallow gasps as I watched in horror. The figures in the static seemed to reach out, their ghostly arms stretching towards my wife and children. And then, just as I thought I would break and run to them, one of the shapes turned its head, or what I assumed was its head, towards me. It was nothing more than a black void, an emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around it, but I knew it could see me. The whispering intensified, the voices rising to a crescendo that made my ears ache. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair, and in that moment, Claire turned to look at me. "You should join us," she said, her voice distorted, as if coming from the TV itself. "It's easier if you don't resist." My blood ran cold. I shook my head, unable to speak, and bolted from the room. I could hear the voices calling after me, urging me to return, to sit with them, to watch the show. But I couldn't. I slammed the door to the bedroom and collapsed on the bed, trembling uncontrollably. As I lay there, trying to convince myself that this was all some terrible nightmare, I realized that the whispering hadn't stopped. It was in the walls now, in the very fabric of the house, following me no matter where I went. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The whispering from the night before had faded into the background, but it was still there, a constant hum at the edge of my hearing. Claire and the kids were already in front of the TV when I woke up, their eyes locked on the static as usual. But now, the static seemed more alive, more malevolent. The shapes within it had grown more defined, and I could feel their gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking directly at the screen. I decided to stay home from work, unable to leave my family alone with whatever was lurking in that television. I needed to figure out what was happening, but I didn't know where to start. My thoughts kept circling back to the TV, to the way it had continued to broadcast even after I'd unplugged it. Something unnatural had taken root in our home, and it was growing stronger by the day. Desperate for answers, I began searching the house for any clue that might explain this madness. I rifled through old family photos, searched the attic for anything unusual, and even checked the basement, but found nothing. My frustration grew with each dead end. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, a gnawing dread that refused to let go. In the afternoon, I decided to try something I hadn't before. I called the cable company. Maybe there was a glitch, a signal interference that could explain the static. But when I finally got through to a customer service representative, they were as baffled as I was. "Sir, there's no record of any show like that on our network," the woman on the phone said. "In fact, your service hasn't registered any active channels for the past week. Are you sure your TV is even connected?" A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "Yes, I'm sure," I replied, my voice shaky. "But the TV is on. They're watching something." The line went silent for a moment. Then, in a quieter voice, the woman asked, "Have you checked your TV for any external devices? Maybe someone connected something without your knowledge." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't thought of that. I rushed back to the living room, ignoring the rising tide of whispering that seemed to follow me through the house. My family didn't react as I approached the TV, their eyes still locked on the screen. I crouched down to inspect the back of the television, half expecting to find some strange device, something that didn't belong. But there was nothing. Just the usual cables, all securely in place. I even checked the power cord again, though I knew it was useless. The TV was operating on something beyond electricity. The woman on the phone was still waiting, her voice tinny in the receiver. "There's nothing here," I said, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over me. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, and I could hear the unease in her voice. "There's really nothing more I can do. Maybe you should consult a technician." I thanked her and hung up, though I knew a technician wouldn't solve this. This wasn't a technical problem, it was something far worse. I stared at the TV, at the shapes that twisted and writhed within the static, and I knew that whatever was inside was growing bolder. It was reaching out, trying to pull us in. Suddenly, Max spoke. His voice was a hollow echo of his usual bright tone. "They want to meet you, Daddy." I turned to him, horrified. His eyes were still fixed on the screen, but there was something different in his expression, something darker. "They said they've been waiting for you." Claire and Emma didn't move, but I could sense they were listening too. The whispering surged around us, filling the room with a thick, oppressive presence. I wanted to scream, to smash the TV to pieces, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the fear that had taken root in my soul. "Why don't you sit with us?" Claire suggested, her voice laced with an unnatural calm. "It's easier if you watch." The TV flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something familiar in the static, my own face, twisted and distorted, staring back at me from the screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering had grown louder, more insistent, filling every corner of the house with its eerie chant. I could feel it pressing in on me, urging me to join my family in the living room, to sit with them in front of that cursed TV. But I resisted, staying locked in the bedroom, clutching my head as the voices clawed at my mind. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands trembling. The house was eerily silent, the whispers finally subsiding as the first light of day crept through the curtains. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to do something, anything, to break whatever hold that TV had over my family. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I left the bedroom and headed for the living room. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but the tension still hung in the air like a thick fog. When I reached the living room, I found Claire, Emma, and Max sitting on the couch, just as they had been every day for the past week. The static still danced on the screen, but now it was more chaotic, the shapes within it more defined. It was as if the figures inside the static were getting closer, pushing against some unseen barrier. "Claire, we need to stop this," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "This isn't normal. We have to turn it off." But she didn't respond. Neither did the kids. They just sat there, their eyes locked on the screen, their faces slack and lifeless. Desperate, I lunged for the TV, trying to yank the power cord from the wall, but as I reached out, a shock of electricity jolted through me, throwing me back. I hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of me, and for a moment, I just lay there, gasping. The static on the TV had intensified, the shapes within it now moving frantically, as if agitated by my attempt to sever their connection. "You can't stop it," Max's voice came from above me, soft but filled with an eerie certainty. "They're already here." I looked up, my heart pounding. Max had turned to face me, his eyes dark and hollow, his voice no longer his own. "We're part of it now, Daddy," he continued, his words sending a chill down my spine. "There's no turning back." Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, looking from Max to Claire and Emma, but they remained as they were, their attention solely on the screen. It was then that I noticed something horrifying, my reflection in the TV screen. Or rather, the lack of it. I should have seen myself standing there, but the screen showed only static, no trace of my own form. A terrible realization dawned on me. Whatever was in that TV, whatever had ensnared my family, it was erasing us, consuming us piece by piece. And now, it had started with me. I had to escape, to get help before it was too late. Without thinking, I rushed towards the front door, but as I reached for the handle, the house seemed to shift around me. The walls rippled, the floor buckled, and I was thrown back into the center of the living room, as if the house itself wouldn't let me leave. The TV crackled, louder now, and I could hear the whispering again, clearer than ever. They were speaking to me, the voices of those who had been consumed before, telling me there was no escape, no salvation. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel and hurled it at the TV. The glass shattered, the screen imploding with a deafening screech, but instead of silence, the static continued to roar, filling the room with an unbearable sound. The whispering voices grew louder, overlapping, merging into a single, monstrous roar. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I was lying on the floor of the living room, the shards of the broken TV scattered around me. Claire, Emma, and Max were gone. The furniture was gone. Everything was gone, except for the static that still buzzed faintly in the air, like the dying breath of some malevolent entity. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and numb, my mind barely able to process what had happened. I called out for my family, but there was no answer, only the endless hum of the static. I was alone, truly alone, in a house that felt like a hollow shell of what it once was. I searched every room, every corner, but there was no trace of them. It was as if they had never existed at all. In the days that followed, I tried to leave the house, but every time I opened the door, I found myself right back in the living room, facing the shattered remnants of the TV. The world outside had become a distant memory, a place I could no longer reach. I was trapped, caught in the static, just like my family before me. And now, I sit here, in the silence of this empty house, waiting for the static to take the last of me, for the final broadcast to end. Because I know, deep down, that there is no escape. The show has only just begun. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. Mother's Eyes. I've always been told I have my mother's eyes. People used to say it like it was a compliment, a way to connect me to the woman I barely remember. She died when I was just 6, leaving behind a void filled with only the vaguest memories, a gentle touch, a lullaby, the way her eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light of our old house. Those who knew her would often smile sadly when they saw me, saying how much I resembled her. It was meant to be comforting, but it always felt like a shadow hanging over me. When I was younger, I didn't pay much attention to the old stories or the whispers that followed my mother's death. My father never spoke about her, not even on the anniversary of her passing. Her name was almost a forbidden word in our house, which only fueled my curiosity as I grew older. It wasn't until I was sorting through the attic years later, after my father's passing, that I found the truth, or at least, the beginning of it. The attic was cluttered with decades of forgotten belongings, a dusty museum of my family's past. I had never been allowed up there as a child, but now it was mine to explore. I wasn't looking for anything in particular when I stumbled upon the old wooden chest. It was tucked away in the corner, buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets and broken furniture. Something about it drew me in, an odd sense of familiarity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The chest creaked ominously as I pried it open, releasing a puff of stale air that carried the scent of age and decay. Inside, I found a collection of glass jars, carefully packed in straw to protect them from breaking. Each jar was sealed tight, with a small piece of faded parchment tied around the neck. The jars were filled with what appeared to be murky liquid, and at first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the labels. Written in my mother's delicate handwriting, each one bore a single name, names I recognized as those of long-deceased relatives. I held one up to the light, squinting to make out the shape suspended in the liquid. My breath caught in my throat when I realized what it was, an eyeball, perfectly preserved, floating lifelessly in the jar. The eye seemed to stare back at me, unblinking, as if it were still alive. My hands shook as I set the jar down, suddenly aware of the cold sweat that had broken out on my forehead. What was this? Why did my mother keep these things? The jars looked old, far older than I was, but the eyes inside seemed unnervingly fresh, as if they had been plucked from their sockets just yesterday. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had found. I wanted to believe it was some kind of macabre joke, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. The old stories, the whispers, there had always been something odd about my mother, something people didn't talk about openly. I had always dismissed it as superstition, the kind of small-town gossip that grows out of boredom and fear. But now, standing in the dim light of the attic, surrounded by my mother's secret collection, I began to question everything I thought I knew. I picked up another jar, this one labeled with a name I didn't recognize. The eye inside was a different color, a deep, oceanic blue that was almost hypnotic. As I stared into the jar, I felt a strange pull, as if the eye was drawing me in, demanding that I look closer. My head spun with the possibilities. Was this some kind of ritual? A twisted hobby? Or was there something darker at play, something connected to the uncanny resemblance I shared with my mother? I was suddenly gripped by a primal fear, a sense that I had uncovered something I was never meant to find. I wanted to close the chest, to shove it back into the darkness and pretend I had never seen it. But I couldn't. I had to know more. With trembling hands, I reached for the last jar in the chest, my heart pounding in my ears. As I lifted it, I noticed that this one was different. The parchment label was blank. I wiped the dust from the glass, peering inside. My blood ran cold as I saw what was floating within. It was an eye, just like the others, but this one was the exact same shade as mine. The jar slipped from my hands, shattering against the attic floor. I barely registered the sound of breaking glass as I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The eye that stared up at me from the pool of liquid on the floor was undeniably mine, same color, same shape, even the faint flecks of gold in the iris. But how could that be? I was very much alive, my own eyes still in my head, seeing this nightmare unfold. I scrambled to the nearest mirror, an old, dusty relic leaning against the wall. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and trembling, but both of my eyes were still there, intact. I leaned closer, examining my eyes with a growing sense of dread. What if there was something wrong with them, something I couldn't see on the surface? The thought made me shudder, and I quickly looked away, my gaze landing back on the broken jar. The eye lay in a sticky puddle, still staring, still accusing. I knew I should clean up the mess, but the sight of the eye made my stomach turn. Instead, I forced myself to focus on the other jars in the chest. I needed answers, and something in that collection had to hold them. But as I picked up each jar, turning them over in my hands, all I found were more eyes, green, brown, hazel, all perfectly preserved and all with names I couldn't quite place. A family tree of eyes, collected by my mother for reasons I couldn't even begin to comprehend. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out all rational thought. I wanted to run, to flee from this attic and never look back, but some dark curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. There was a mystery here, one that I was now entangled in, whether I liked it or not. I had to understand what my mother had done, what she had been. And the only place I could think to start was the one place in the house I had always avoided, her old bedroom. The room had been left untouched since her death, a shrine to a woman no one dared to remember. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the air inside thick with dust and the scent of faded perfume. The room was dim, the heavy curtains blocking out the afternoon sun, but I could still make out the details, the old vanity, the ornate bed frame, the wardrobe that loomed like a sentinel in the corner. Everything was just as she had left it, frozen in time. I approached the vanity, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The mirror above it was clouded with age, but I could still see the ghostly outline of my reflection as I stood before it. On the vanity lay an array of trinkets, a silver hairbrush, a hand mirror, a small box carved with intricate designs. My fingers hesitated over the box, something telling me that whatever was inside would only deepen the horror I was already experiencing. But I couldn't stop myself. I lifted the lid, my breath catching as I saw what lay within. Nestled in the velvet-lined interior were more eyes, loose, uncontained, rolling slightly as I opened the box. These were different from the ones in the jars. They seemed older, their colors faded, some almost milky white with age. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I slammed the lid shut, backing away from the vanity. I didn't understand. Why had she kept these? What could they possibly mean? My mind raced with questions, but none of the answers seemed plausible. All I knew was that there was something deeply wrong with this house, with my family, and with me. I was connected to this twisted legacy in ways I couldn't yet fathom, But one thing was clear, my mother had been more than just the kind, quiet woman everyone remembered. As I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye, a piece of paper tucked into the corner of the vanity's mirror. I pulled it free, unfolding it with trembling hands. The handwriting was my mother's, delicate and flowing, just like the labels on the jars. The note was short, just a few words, but they made my blood run cold. To see as I saw. I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. What did she mean? How could this be connected to the jars, to the eyes? A thought crept into my mind, one so horrifying that I tried to push it away. But it wouldn't leave, gnawing at me, insisting that I confront it. What if my mother had somehow transplanted her sight into those jars? What if these eyes were still seeing, still watching, even after all these years? I stumbled out of the room, the note clutched in my hand, my mind spinning. I needed to get out of the house, to clear my head, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a faint sound behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of fabric or the sigh of a distant breeze. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I slowly turned back toward my mother's bedroom. The door, which I had left wide open, was now closed. And from behind it, I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I stood frozen on the landing, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth behind the closed door. My mind raced, struggling to find a rational explanation. Perhaps it was just the old house settling, or maybe I was imagining things, seeing and hearing what I expected in the aftermath of uncovering my mother's macabre secrets. But deep down, I knew the truth was far worse. Something was in that room. Gathering every ounce of courage, I took a tentative step toward the door. The air around me seemed to thicken, growing heavy with a sense of dread. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears as I reached for the doorknob. My fingers trembled as they brushed the cold metal, but before I could turn it, the footsteps abruptly stopped. Silence fell over the house, thick and oppressive. I stood there, hand hovering over the knob, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the other side of the door, so soft it was almost a breath. "You have her eyes." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. It wasn't just the words themselves that terrified me, it was the voice. It was familiar, painfully so. It was my mother's voice, or at least something trying to sound like her. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever was in that room was calling to me. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I bolted down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The front door loomed ahead, my escape route, but as I reached for it, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't just coming from behind the closed door. It was all around me, seeping out of the walls, the floor, the very air itself. To see as I saw, the voices chanted, growing louder with each repetition. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices seemed to be inside my head, drilling into my thoughts, eroding my sense of reality. I had to get out, I had to escape. I fumbled with the lock on the door, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp the latch. The voices grew more frantic, more insistent, as if they knew I was about to break free. Finally, with a sharp click, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the cold evening air. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. The night was falling quickly, shadows stretching long and menacing across the ground. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the last vestiges of the whispers, fading into the distance as I sprinted down the deserted road. Only when I was far enough away to feel safe did I finally stop, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I leaned against a tree, trying to steady myself, but the world seemed to spin around me. The whispers were gone, but their words lingered in my mind, replaying over and over. "You have her eyes." What did that mean? Was it just some twisted ghost trying to scare me, or was there something more to it? I reached up to touch my eyes, half expecting them to be different somehow, but they felt the same. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental that I couldn't see. As I stood there in the gathering darkness, a sense of hopelessness washed over me. I had left the house, but the house hadn't left me. I could still feel its presence, looming in the back of my mind, whispering to me from some deep, dark corner. I knew I couldn't just run away, not really. Whatever was happening, whatever my mother had done, it was part of me now. The only way to end this nightmare was to go back and face it head on. I had no idea what I would do when I got there or how I could possibly fight something I didn't understand. But there was no other choice. I turned back toward the house, my footsteps slow and reluctant, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and never look back. But I couldn't leave it unfinished. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. As I approached the house, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, lights flickering in the windows, like candles burning in the dark. I knew I hadn't left any lights on, and the sight filled me with dread. But I kept moving forward, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step I took. They were calling me back, urging me to return to the place where it all began. And as I reached the front door, now slightly ajar, I knew there was no turning back. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop. The house was different now, the shadows deeper, the air thicker. The whispers were everywhere, overlapping and echoing, a cacophony of voices all saying the same thing, to see as I saw. I followed the sound, my feet moving on their own, leading me up the stairs and down the hall, straight to my mother's bedroom. The door was open this time, the room bathed in a sickly yellow light. I hesitated at the threshold, my body trembling with fear, but the voices pushed me forward. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in with whatever awaited me in the dark. The door's sudden slam echoed through the room, cutting off any chance of escape. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a living thing, a relentless tide of voices all chanting the same haunting phrase, to see as I saw. The sickly yellow light flickered, casting strange shadows across the room, and as I looked around, I realized I was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. They were hazy, almost transparent, like the remnants of old photographs left to fade over time. But as they came closer, I could see their eyes, each one eerily familiar, each one a perfect match for the eyes in the jars. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These were the spirits of my ancestors, the ones whose eyes my mother had collected. And now they had returned, drawn to me by some twisted bond one couldn't understand. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence pressing down on me, their intent clear in the way they stared, intense, unblinking, as if they were seeing through me, into the very depths of my soul. I wanted to run, to flee from the room and never look back, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen by an unseen force. As the spirits surrounded me, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, more insistent. To see as I saw, they chanted, their voices melding into one. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the words seemed to bore into my mind. And then, without warning, the figures parted, making way for a new presence, a woman, stepping out from the deepest shadows. She was beautiful, with flowing dark hair and eyes that shimmered like polished glass. But there was something wrong with her, something that made my skin crawl. Her movements were too smooth, too precise, like a puppet on strings, and when she spoke, her voice was a low, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "You have her eyes," she said, echoing the words that had haunted me since I first found the jars. As she came closer, I realized who she was, my mother, or at least, something that wore her face. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the truth in their depths. These were the same eyes I had inherited, the same eyes that had led me to this cursed legacy. But they weren't just hers, they were the eyes of all who had come before, passed down through generations like some twisted inheritance. "You don't understand yet," she whispered, her hand reaching out to touch my face. Her fingers were cold, colder than death, and I flinched at the contact. "But you will. Soon, you will see as I saw. And when you do, you'll understand why I did what I did." I tried to pull away, but I was trapped, held in place by her gaze. My mother, if that's what she truly was, smiled, a sad, wistful smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the only way, she continued, her voice softening. The only way to protect our family. To keep the darkness at bay. You have her eyes, and now, you must take up the burden I carried. You must continue the ritual. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. I won't. I can't. You have no choice, she replied, her tone firm, final. This is your destiny, just as it was mine. You must collect the eyes, keep them safe, or the darkness will consume us all. As she spoke, the room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing darker. The spirits surrounding us began to chant again, their voices rising to a fever pitch. My mother's hand tightened on my face, her fingers digging into my skin, and I felt something shift within me, a cold, creeping sensation that started in my eyes and spread through my entire body. I could see her eyes, those familiar yet alien orbs, and felt the weight of generations of pain, suffering, and fear pressing down on me. Suddenly, my vision changed. I saw not with my own eyes, but with the eyes of the spirits around me, their lives flashing before my mind in rapid succession, births, deaths, the horrors they had witnessed, the rituals they had performed. It was overwhelming, suffocating, like drowning in a sea of memories that weren't my own. And through it all, my mother's voice whispered in my mind, guiding me, shaping me. You must see as I saw, she repeated, her voice blending with the chants, becoming one with the darkness. Only then can you fulfill your purpose. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat as I fought against the visions, against the fate that was being forced upon me. But it was no use. The darkness swallowed me whole, dragging me down into a void where time and space ceased to exist. And as I fell, I felt my mother's presence all around me, her hands guiding me, her eyes watching me, her voice whispering in my ear. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The darkness receded, the whispers faded, and I found myself standing in the middle of the room, alone. The spirits were gone, the house silent and still. But something was different. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy, in the way the shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of my vision. I looked into the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. My eyes, they were the same, yet not. There was a new depth to them, a darkness that hadn't been there before. And as I gazed into them, I understood. I had seen as she saw, and now, the burden was mine to bear. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing. The house seemed to come alive around me, the whispers starting up again, soft and subtle, urging me to take the next step, to continue the ritual. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to get out, to clear my head, to think. I turned and fled from the room, down the stairs, and out into the night, the whispers chasing me all the way. But no matter how far I ran, I knew I could never truly escape. The eyes, her eyes, were with me now. They were mine, just as they had always been. And as I stared up at the house one last time, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness, I realized that I would be back. I had to be. Because now, the darkness was mine to keep at bay. The ritual was mine to continue. And the eyes, they would never let me go. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.